The first complaint didn't come from a neighbor. It came straight from the HOA president. She said my Airbnb was illegal. She said short-term rentals weren't allowed and that I had to shut it down immediately. She warned that fines were already being prepared and that enforcement would be swift. What she didn't know was that I'd already gone through the city. I had a short-term rental permit, inspections, approval, everything signed and on record. She never checked any of it. And the moment I realized she was trying to shut down something the city had already approved, I knew this wasn't about rules or noise or parking. It was about control. And one city-issued document was about to end the entire. The Airbnb wasn't some spur-of-the-moment idea. I didn't just throw a listing online and hope for the best. Before a single guest ever stayed there, I did the research. I checked city zoning rules. I reviewed short-term rental ordinances. I spoke with the city licensing office and submitted everything they required. Inspections were done. Fees were paid. A short-term rental permit was issued in my name and tied directly to the property. Everything was documented. The house itself was quiet. It wasn't a party rental. No loud music. No crowds. Most guests were couples or families passing through for a few nights. Check-ins were handled digitally. Parking was controlled. Trash was managed carefully. 4 months, there were no problems. Neighbors didn't complain. The city didn't raise concerns. Even the HOA stayed silent, at least at first. That changed when the current HOA president took over. She was vocal about protecting the neighborhood. She talked often about preserving property values and maintaining a certain image. And while the HOA rules were vague about rentals, she made it clear she didn't like the idea of strangers staying in the community. At first, it was subtle. General emails about unauthorized activity. Reminders about residential use only. Warnings about enforcement coming soon. I didn't think much of it. Then one morning, I opened my email and saw a message with my address in the subject line. She said the HOA had become aware that my property was being used as an Airbnb. She said short-term rentals were not allowed and that I was required to shut it down immediately. She warned that fines would begin if I didn't comply. There was no mention of complaints. No reference to a specific rule. Just authority and urgency. I replied calmly. I told her the rental was permitted by the city. I attached my short-term rental license. I explained that the operation complied with all city regulations and had passed inspection. Her response came quickly. She said city approval didn't matter. She said HOA rules superseded any permit. She told me the listing needed to come down or enforcement would follow. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't asking questions. She wasn't trying to understand. She was counting on me not knowing where HOA authority actually ended. At first, I tried to handle it the same way I handled everything else, calmly and in writing. I replied to her email and attached my city-issued short-term rental permit again. I included the inspection approval and a link to the city ordinance that explicitly allowed short-term rentals under certain conditions. I pointed out that I was meeting every requirement and that there had been no complaints from guests, neighbors, or the city. Her response wasn't about clarification. It was about control. She said the HOA didn't allow hotel-style use. She said even if the city approved it, the HOA had the right to protect the community from transient occupancy. She warned that continuing to operate the Airbnb would result in daily fines and possible legal action. There was still no reference to a specific rule. No section number. No amendment. Just authority. A few days later, the first fine appeared on my HOA account. It wasn't large, but it was clear what it was meant to do: establish dominance. The notice cited unauthorized rental activity and warned that additional penalties would follow if the listing remained active. I asked again for documentation. This time, she sent screenshots from an HOA guideline packet, generic language about residential use, Nothing that mentioned short-term rentals or city permits. I pointed that out. She ignored it. Instead, she escalated. The fines doubled. Then tripled. Late fees were added automatically. Each notice used stronger language, threatening liens and suspension of HOA privileges if I didn't comply. That's when the pressure spread beyond emails. A neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash and asked if I was running a hotel. Another mentioned that the HOA president had told people short-term renters were a safety concern. Someone else said she'd warned the board that allowing my Airbnb would open the floodgates. None of them had seen my permit. They were repeating what they'd been told. I contacted the HOA management company directly. I sent them copies of my permit, inspection report, and the city ordinance. I asked them to explain how the HOA could override a legally issued license. They responded cautiously. They said enforcement decisions came from the board president. They suggested I appeal, after shutting the rental down. Stop first. Argue later. I contacted the board members individually. Most didn't respond. One replied with a vague message saying the issue was complicated. Another said the president was acting in the best interest of the community. No one wanted to challenge her. The fines continued to pile up. By then, the amount was no longer symbolic. It was punitive. And it was clear she was counting on financial pressure to force compliance. So I went back to the city. I contacted the short-term rental office and explained exactly what was happening. I forwarded the HOA notices, the fine statements, and her emails claiming the permit didn't matter. The city's response was immediate. They said the permit was valid. They said the HOA could not nullify it unless there was a clear, written prohibition in the governing documents, and even then, enforcement would have limits. They said if the HOA continued interfering, the city could issue a formal clarification letter. That was the moment everything shifted. I informed the HOA president that I'd contacted the city and that they were prepared to put their position in writing. Her reply came back almost instantly. She said the city often misunderstood HOA authority. She said the HOA had broader powers than zoning officials realized. She warned me again to take the listing down before things escalated further. That's when it became obvious. She wasn't confused. She was deliberately ignoring facts that didn't support her position. So I asked the city for more than an email. I requested official documentation. The letter from the city didn't arrive quietly. It came by certified mail, addressed directly to the HOA management company and the entire board. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an opinion. It was a formal clarification of law, written in unmistakable language and stamped with the city seal. It stated that my property was legally permitted for short-term rental use. It cited the ordinance by number. It referenced the inspection history. And it made one thing crystal clear. The HOA had no authority to prohibit or penalize a city-approved short-term rental unless there was a clearly written, legally enforceable rule in the governing documents. There wasn't. The letter went further. It warned that continued fines or enforcement actions could expose the HOA to legal liability for unlawful interference with a licensed activity. It advised immediate suspension of all penalties and demanded written confirmation that enforcement had stopped. I forwarded the letter to the HOA president. This time, there was no reply, no warning, no threat, no attempt to reinterpret the rules. Hours passed. Then an entire day. The silence said everything. The next message didn't come from her. It came from the HOA's attorney. The tone was completely different from anything I'd received before. Careful, neutral, legal. They said the HOA was re-evaluating enforcement procedures, and that all fines related to my property had been placed on hold pending review. By that evening, every fine vanished from my account. The following week, a special HOA meeting was announced. The agenda included one item: clarification of short-term rental enforcement. I attended. So did several neighbors. The city's letter was read aloud in full. The attorney explained that HOA authority did not override municipal licensing. He explained that vague language about residential use could not be stretched to ban permitted activity retroactively. He explained that any future restriction would require a formal amendment process and could not apply to existing permits. The HOA president tried to justify her actions. She said she was protecting property values. She said she believed short-term rentals were harmful. She said she acted in good faith. But none of that mattered. Because belief isn't law. And authority doesn't come from confidence, it comes from jurisdiction. The board voted unanimously to stop enforcement against my Airbnb. A written notice was issued acknowledging the city's position and confirming that licensed short-term rentals were allowed under current rules. The president didn't argue after that. She didn't object to the vote. She sat quietly while her authority unraveled in real time, undone by a document she never bothered to read. The listing stayed live. Guests continued to come. After the meeting, everything changed. The HOA stopped sending warnings. The fines never returned. And the tone of every message coming from the board shifted almost immediately. A community-wide email went out a few days later. It explained that short-term rentals with valid city permits were allowed under the current rules and that enforcement would be handled in coordination with applicable municipal regulations. The wording was careful, neutral, and clearly written by someone who didn't want another legal letter on their desk. My name was never mentioned. But everyone knew what had happened. Neighbors who had quietly watched from the sidelines started reaching out. Some admitted they'd assumed the HOA president knew what she was talking about. Others said they'd questioned it but didn't want to get involved. A few even asked how I'd gone about getting a permit, now that they knew it was possible. The fear that had surrounded the issue dissolved almost overnight. The Airbnb continued operating exactly the way it always had. Quiet guests. Controlled parking. No disturbances. No complaints from the city. No issues with inspections. The thing that had been painted as a threat to the neighborhood turned out to be what it always was, a legally permitted use of private property. The HOA president didn't step down, but her influence faded. Enforcement decisions were no longer made unilaterally. Legal review became routine. Vague interpretations were replaced with written policy. The board became cautious, almost hesitant, in situations where they'd once been aggressive. Power had limits again. And that was the real outcome. Not humiliation. Not revenge. Just balance being restored. The situation reminded a lot of people of something they'd forgotten, that HOAs aren't governments, and confidence doesn't create authority. Paperwork does. Jurisdiction does. And when someone pushes past those boundaries without checking, it only works until the right authority shows up. In the end, nothing dramatic had to happen. No shouting. No confrontation. Just one city-issued permit doing exactly what it was meant to do. Because when rules are followed properly, they protect everyone, even from